Yeah, appreciate. Actually interesting that I didn't really know what Jan is going to be talking much and the questions that will follow, but it absolutely leads into why we need to talk about this, right? So there were questions raised about we need a better tool for interpretation. There were questions raised about, okay, so we go deep dive into this age clock or that age clock or whatever age clock, but each one tells a component of the story. So how do we bring all of that together to truly understand human health, human aging, and let's say health optimization? The risk versus reward, right? So if we focus certain therapies just on certain target, like an age clock or a certain bacteria in the gut or whatever, yes, we might move the needle there, but we may be causing harmful consequences elsewhere. So again, just optimizing even intervention on single clocks or single domains may be an issue. So multi-omics really matters. Systemic approach to health really matters. So I'm going to talk about what we're doing at New, how we're trying to bring all of these different aspects of human health, of science, of data, of analysis of clocks, but at the same time also creating an interpretation tool so that can guide our decision-making in a more informed way when we understand how things connect with one another, which things are in the driver's seat and which things are more, kind of correlational and which things are actually more of a consequence. But with that, before I go kind of deeper into that, maybe just I stop here where Michael was actually at his talk. And, I think it is really important for us to kind of just continuously reflect the fact that we are, here now in, I don't know which year of the Longevity Summit Dublin with, field of longevity exploding. We're doing all this research on age clocks and longevity and regeneration and epigenetic reprogramming, and yet at the same time, the gap between the health span and lifestyle is widening even further. The chronic diseases are even faster growing. We're currently at about 10 trillion per year economic burden. It's going to grow to about 30 trillion in the next couple of decades, etc. And then the second part is also as kind of how we approach things. So, some are, with this curve that we're all familiar with, some are really looking towards that, let's say, lifespan and kind of the extension areas. Most are kind of focused on the health span, so squaring the curve. But there is a lot of also neglected field that all of our work actually touches upon is actually health throughout life. So there's, stuff happening in terms of, anxiety, depression, all those things where we are actually, again, not really looking systemically. We give an SSRI, we say, okay, let's, let that be done with, but we're not really looking into, the gut-brain connections. We're not looking into kind of a, genetic interplays between your, what types of hormones bacteria producing, your genes are synthesizing, what's going on with the neurotransmitters and so on and so forth. So really building tools that enable us to take that systemic view and bring it all together into a good interpretation is really what's crucial for that next phase of let's say, development as a field. And also to kind of Aubrey's question, we need these types of tools with multiple angles, with multiple clocks, with multiple understandings when designing then interventions to follow through and continuously learning through time series which interventions actually move the needle systemically, not on a particular clock per se, but really systemically, right? And so in this slide, I tried to kind of just paint the picture. I was at this Longevity Docs Summit last week, and it was really about what the practitioners currently to do in healthcare, and it's still very, very siloed. So there's people focusing on genetics, people focusing on microbes, on blood, and so on. No one is really connecting the dots. It's very responsive, so we're still a sick care industry. It's also lacks personalization. It's still a very generic first line of response. But the most important is as we are moving, in this field of all these different sciences, even in the application side of things, many are now trying to adopt, like, we do a genome test, an epigenome test, a microbiome test, all these kind of omics, but it's overwhelming. And again, it's each data is telling a different story, and these are suggesting eat broccoli and don't eat broccoli, or have eggs, don't eat eggs. So it's really the complexity of these multi-omics is how do we allow this interpretation tool to be better. Then the second part, which is also very important, I'll just touch on it at the end of the talk, is using AI. Right? There was a question from the panelists: how many people are using GPT or Gemini these days? And the whole room, 250 clinicians stood up. Okay, how many are using it on a weekly basis? Everybody standing up. How many on a daily basis? A few people sat down, but still most standing up. Okay, so how many of you are actually using private, guardrailed, secure environment without, with HIPAA compliance, GDPR, and so on. So everybody sat down. Maybe 2-3 people were standing up, right? So we're sending patient data into a GPT and just think it's okay. That's kind of point of failure number one. Point of failure number two is also these are language models, right? They have no clue about, shotgun sequence of, metagenome analysis, how that connects to your genetics and epigenome and so on and so forth. These are language models. Yes, maybe for a blood PDF report from a LabCorp or something like that, they might do fine. But really going down to raw health data, they are not appropriately suited. So that was kind of the mission of NU. That's what we are trying to do as a company, is really kind of create this, let's say, an operating system for health intelligence to kind of bring all these different multi-omics into kind of one unified understanding of how, different omics, different insights and so on work with one another. And I'll show you how we've kind of built the platform. So our idea was really, kind of saying, okay, so what drives our health? How can we understand our health, right? To some degree, it's our biology, right? Our genes encode what our cells can do, but we know that they're just a tiny component of what eventually materializes to be, right? Then we have a whole bunch of gut microbes and skin microbes and so on that do a whole bunch of other things on top. So they contribute millions and millions of additional genes, signaling pathways, and so on, right? And then we have our story through life, how we've been expressing, upregulating, downregulating, things like that, and so on, that Michael was talking about earlier, the epigenome, right? Then we have the reality of the body. We have the bloods, the proteins, the transcription, and so on, right? So this is all the biome. But that doesn't yet fully tell us, like, what is your body today? So we have a physiome, we have, visceral fat, bone mineral density, we have all these kind of things. So we need to understand that part as well. But then if we want to create an engaging interaction, we want to know about your stress levels, your sleep patterns, your anxiety, and so on. So we have the wearable devices, we have the rings, the watches, the CGMs, the VO2 maxes, and so on, right? And recently, in the last couple of years, there's been really important publications that finally shed the light on how important, of course, our environment is. The air quality, the stress, the lifestyle, and so on and so forth, right? So kind of the exposome. Many newer buildings are now kind of including smart house design with CO2 meters and all these kind of things. It affects the sleep. I mean, to me, it's a game changer. When I started to use a CO2 measurement in my bedroom, seeing how my CO2 drops during the night, we've completely redesigned the ventilation systems and so on. It's a night and day in terms of the recovery next morning. Taking that decades of life, it really also impacts probably your, let's say, neuroinflammation or whatever, right? So all of that feeding into one system that has been then trained on what do we know about that stuff. So looking through, scientific literature, clinical literature, biobank data, and so on, and trying to kind of connect the dots between all of these omics, and then driving out, back to Jan's question earlier, really, how do we interpret that? What insights can we be learned? How are the correlations of these types of engines being kind of done? I will skip this because I see I'm running short on time, but kind of just massive graph, knowledge graphs, data banks, and so on, with hundreds of relationships between all of these biomarkers, tens of thousands of nodes, and so on. Trying to kind of say, and again, what this somehow shows is, the more data I provide in, the more kind of exciting things will come out on the other side. But also, just on limited data, I can already see a lot of correlations starting to happen. And of course, with AI and machine learning, we can then sooner or later start also inferring and imputing missing information. So kind of you start with lots, but then you can also start going back in reverse from scarcity. Now, how does this type of an insight actually work? So we've built the knowledge graph based on health insights that are actually coming from the same angle from a clinical practice, right? So we want to make sure that things are clinically relevant. So if we're talking about vascular health or metabolic and so on, right? So we want to see what type of evidence is there out there to kind of connect different types of inputs and different types of outputs. But then going back to our kind of multi-omics approach, context is also really important. So we really need to understand what is going on within a certain individual that is driving certain types of identified biomarker, which may be triggering the expression or certain type of effects in your biological data that may be connecting to various types of recommendation outputs that may lead a practitioner to say, oh, let's change a diet and give some supplements. But at the same time, certain, let's say, intervention decisions may be not recommended by other aspects of your biology, by other aspects of your, background information and so on. So it's really about almost every component has so many different interconnections that play with one another. And so biology is really messy, and this is something we're trying to build here with this system, is to kind of be able to look at this totality of interconnections. And what we're building now in the next phase, I'll show in a later slide, is almost this kind of agentic approach to querying different aspects of your biology and seeing how they work with one another. So just taking a very simple, illustration of a homocysteine, let's say, an elevated homocysteine. We're very familiar with that. Very often you would say, okay, yeah, that's often connected to your MTHFR pathways, and maybe it will have a consequence in your cardiovascular, and of course more on a day-to-day basis, maybe MTHFR blockages, etc., may also lead to a whole bunch of, let's say, cognitive functions like anxiety, depression, and so on, right? But at the same time, elevated homocysteine is also associated with elevated risk of stroke. And so taking into account of all the inputs from genetics, from your physical to, past history of smoking, alcohol, and so on, nutrition, etc., methionine intake, etc., you can really build a much more solid predictive model of what may be a true elevated risk that we should pay attention to, rather than something, kind of as a first shot generic response, oh, an elevated homocysteine, right? But then also, what do we do with that? Because depending on the types of, so I said earlier, the context matter, the outputs in terms of what should we do with that and what type of supplements or lifestyle changes and so on is actually going to be very important. In maybe a very simplified manner, I can just sometimes that it's easier to explain. For me, something as simple as taking a vitamin E pill, a vitamin E supplement, for example, right? Because of my genetics, because of my, let's say, GSTP1, I recover much slower on vitamin E. I have much poor response on exercise and so on. But more importantly, because of my COMT, I would have an elevated risk for cancer, right? Another one with let's say, a turmeric would have an increased risk of a acute liver failure, etc., right? So all of these things here really matter when you're trying to design an intervention. It's not just these inputs, oh, the most standard approach is something else. You again have to look into all the other connected stories, right? So anyway, moving forward from the, let's say, just the multi-omics data analysis and driving recommendations, going back to the stories of clocks. So clocks are an insight, right? So clocks are another view of understanding correlation of health data, right? So one is, okay, biomarkers driving risk, but the other one is combination of various biomarkers being associated with your biological age. And there was a good question earlier, what does that actually mean? Does that mean you are biologically so and so old? Or is it really meaning that you are so much more likely to be at risk for chronic disease, age-related comorbidities, and mortality, right? And the reality is, I mean, I'll be honest about our clocks. We are training them in such a way, right? So it's training them against the risk of, of chronic disease, of comorbidities, and mortality. But also, what we want to understand really is the actionability and the explainability of these clocks. So we really want to look, if I say, a microbiome age or a blood age and so on, what is driving it and to what degree, what its percentage weight score. But then more so than just that, what we want to say is, look, every component tells a story. So yes, while there may be, a certain situation right now going on in my gut, I actually had, whatever situation, but my blood is great, my, physical body is such and such. So we try to look at holistically each one, to what degree does it contribute to my overall, let's say, biological aging, to my overall risk, and how much actionable it is and how much variable it is. And so we really try to, again, take a relatively systemic approach to how can we take multiple angles, combine them into a unified understanding, and then through time really see how we can adjust and manipulate each one so that it's going overall in a let's say, good direction. I'm not going to be spending time on this one, but in terms of our clocks, again, what's to me very important is almost every biomarker has a story. So every biomarker, depending on age, sex, ethnicity, and so on, will have a different, let's say, risk-adjusted curve. And some are going to be linear, some are going to be U-shaped, some are going to be V-shaped. They're not going to be in a same shape, even at different times of let's say, for a youth. They may be more V for a midlife person. They may be a more U, and so on. They will be moving in a different direction, and so on. But every marker has its optimal space within a certain, let's say, phase, but also within a certain context. So for an athlete at kind of peak training performance, the certain biomarkers are expected to be higher for them to be recovering well versus somebody who's sedentary. So it really, again, it needs to be looked into from a context. And in terms of clocks, I also want to mention that we're super, super proud and happy to be working with some amazing teams out there. So, we work with Clock Foundation to have their, GRIMAGE and the PhenoAge. Varun will be, talking after me. We're super excited that we'll be able to bring the TrueAge clocks into the platform, the Symphony Age, the Dunedin Pace. And big fan of David Furman's work, and we're super proud to say that we'll be able to support the Cosmica with the Beyond Age and the visualization. So, the message here is there's so much exciting science being developed by all of the industry out there, and the importance is that each one tells a very important perspective on, let's say, human biology and our aging processes, right? And the idea is to be able to really take a systemic approach and like Aubrey asked, a time series longitudinal view of interventions versus how those affect various of these risk factors and clocks to really start making meaningful cells of what works towards our longevity journey. I'll skip this part because I'm out of time. Just really kind of want to double down on don't use public domain GPTs. And also context really matters. So this is why it's important to build not just broad, deep learning and so on, but knowledge graphs that are context aware, that are guardrailed. And so that's only when AI really starts making matter in messy health data. The future where we believe is really going to be very deeply agentic into different kind of domain areas, and only then talking to a kind of a more superficial, let's say, how do you say, interaction with your digital self. I'll leave this as a running last slide, taking a couple of questions if it makes sense, and then that's it, yeah. But yeah, this is how we look.